It is the greatest cold case in human history. A story that has captivated us, haunted us, for more than 2 millennia. It is a story of a perfect civilization, a paradise of impossible wealth, engineering, and military might. A city of concentric rings of land and water, gleaming with precious metals, ruled by 10 god-descended kings. A continental empire that, in a single day and night of violent cataclysm, was swallowed by the sea and vanished from human memory, leaving behind nothing but a name, Atlantis. The name itself evokes a feeling of profound loss, of a golden age buried beneath the waves. It is a story of a before time, a lost utopia. The human psyche craves this. We want to believe there was a time when we were better, when we were in harmony with the gods, before our own corruption led to a great fall. The story of Atlantis is the ultimate story of a fall from grace, a technological and moral Garden of Eden from which we were violently expelled. For over 2,000 years, we have been obsessed with it. We have launched 1,000 expeditions, written 10,000 books, and spent millions of dollars searching for it. We have looked in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, in Antarctica, in Scandinavia, in Bolivia, even in space. We have pointed to every major ancient ruin, from Stonehenge to the pyramids, to Tiwanaku, and whispered, what if this is a colony? A remnant of that lost mother culture? And every single search has come back empty. The hunt for Atlantis has become a mirror, reflecting the dreams, the fears, and the delusions of every generation that seeks it. It has become a magnet for fringe theories, for wishful thinking, and for outright fantasy. It is a story that has been co-opted by mystics, by spiritualists, by nationalist pseudo-historians claiming their nation as the true homeland of this master race, and by internet sleuths with satellite photos. But what if we've been looking in the wrong way? What if the story is not a simple fable? What if the clues to its true location have been hiding in plain sight, dismissed by academics as fiction, misinterpreted by enthusiasts as proof, or ignored entirely? What if the story is not a simple myth, but a deeply garbled memory? A memory of a real place, a real people, and a real, world-ending cataclysm. And what if the final, shocking location has been staring us in the face all along? This is the hunt for the true location of Atlantis, and the clues that no one saw. Our story begins, and ends, with one man. Not a historian, not an archaeologist, not a mystic, but a philosopher. Plato. Every single thing we know, or think we know, about Atlantis comes from 2 of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. It is not a legend passed down through 100 cultures. It is not a story from the Bible, or the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Vedas. It is, quite literally, a story told by one man, in Athens, around 360 BC. If these 2 documents do not describe a real place, then no such place ever existed. Everything else is commentary. The story is a nested doll. It's a story within a story within a story. Plato writes the dialogue. In the dialogue, his character Critias tells a story. He begins by saying, I will repeat a tale. Which, though strange, is certainly true. He claims he heard it from his grandfather, who was 90 at the time, who heard it from his father, who heard it from the great Athenian lawgiver Solon, one of the 7 sages of Greece. Solon, Plato writes, traveled to Egypt around 570 BC, to the city of Sais in the Nile Delta. There, he spoke with the most ancient of the priests. He tried to impress them with Greek history, telling them of the great flood of Deucalion and the first man, Pharaonius, the priest, Plato says, looked at Solon with pity. He smiled and said, O Solon, Solon, you Hellenes are never anything but children, and there is not an old man among you. He explained that the Greeks, and all peoples, have their memories wiped clean by periodic cataclysms of fire and water, which is why their histories only go back a few thousand years. The Egyptians, he said, were different. Their civilization, protected by the Nile, was ancient. And in their sacred records, preserved in the temples, was the story of the greatest civilization of all. A civilization that the Greeks had forgotten. The priest described a mighty power that came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean. There was, he said, an island situated in front of the straits which are by you called the Pillars of Hercules. The Pillars of Hercules. The Strait of Gibraltar. For Plato's Greeks, This was the absolute edge of the known, civilized world. Beyond it lay the great, terrifying, unknown Atlantic, an ocean of mud, monsters, and endless chaos. And in that ocean, said the priest, lay this island, larger than Libya and Asia combined. Let us be clear. For a Greek in 360 BC, Libya meant North Africa, and Asia meant what we call Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey. So this was a continent, a landmass of continental scale. And from this island, he said, there was a way to the other islands, and from these you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent, which surrounded the true ocean. This is a staggering detail, an island-hopping route to a second continent, on the other side of the Atlantic. A continent like the Americas. This single passage has fueled centuries of pre-Columbian contact theories. On this continent island, the priest continued, a great and wonderful empire had arisen. And its capital city, its center of power, was called Atlantis. In the second dialogue, the Critias, Plato gives a breathtaking, engineering-level description of its origin and layout. He says the island was given to the god Poseidon in the great dividing of the world. There, Poseidon fell in love with the mortal woman, Cleito, who lived on a hill. To protect her, he built a city. He broke the ground, Plato says, and created alternate zones of sea and land, 2 of land and 3 of water, concentric one with another, as if with a lathe. So that no man could get to the island, a perfect, geometrically impossible city of 5 rings. The central island, Plato says, was for the god and for the royal palace. The 2 rings of land were settled by his 10 sons, the first 10 kings of Atlantis. The eldest, Atlas, gave the island and the ocean their name. His twin, Cadaris, ruled the part of the island nearest the Pillars of Hercules, which is why that area is still called Gades, or Cadiz, today. This detail, this etymological link, feels so specific, so real. The city was a marvel of engineering. The kings built bridges, cased in metal, connecting the land rings. They dug tunnels, so that their warships, or triremes, could pass under the rings of land. They cut a massive canal, 300 feet wide and 100 feet deep, straight from the outer ring of water, 5 miles long, or 50 stadia, to the open sea. The city itself was impossibly wealthy. The kings, Plato says, had such an amount of wealth as was never before possessed by kings and potentates. They coated the city's walls in metal, the outer wall in brass, the middle wall in tin, and the inner wall, the wall of the citadel itself, flashed with the red light of orichalcum. Orichalcum. This is a word that has launched 1,000 theories. A mysterious, unknown metal, which Plato says was more precious in those days than anything except gold, and was mined from the earth in many parts of the island. Was it a natural alloy of copper and gold? Was it amber? Was it a form of brass, polished to a high sheen? The name itself simply means mountain copper. In 2015, ingots of what archaeologists called orichalcum were found in a 2,600-year-old shipwreck off Sicily. They were of brass alloy. But was this Plato's metal? We don't know. For Plato, it was the symbol of their vast, earthly wealth. They built their buildings from stone quarried from beneath the island, stone that was white, black, and red. As they quarried, they created massive, hollowed-out docks under the land rings. The bridges connecting the land rings were also coated in metal. The central island had a temple to Poseidon, a stadium in length, and half a stadium in width, a proportion of 2 to 1, just like the Parthenon in Athens. All of the outside of the temple, except the pinnacles, they covered with silver, and the pinnacles with gold. The inside was cased in ivory, gold, silver, and orichalcum. Inside was a colossal gold statue of Poseidon in his chariot, driving 6-winged horses, a statue so tall it touched the roof. There were hot and cold springs, baths for the kings and for the common people, and separate baths for horses and cattle. There were gymnasiums. The land rings were filled with docks, shipyards, and a harbor so dense with shipping that the sound of human voices and the din of all sorts was heard day and night. The harbor, he says, held 1,200 ships of war. The military was highly organized. The Great Plain was divided into 60,000 lots. Each of the 10 districts had to provide a quota, a certain number of chariots, horses, soldiers, and sailors. The total army numbered over 1,000,000 men, with 10,000 chariots. It was a bureaucratic, organized, terrifying military machine. The city sat on a great plain, which was surrounded by mountains to the north. The plains were fertile, fed by a massive, grid-like irrigation canal, 10,000 stadia in length, over 1,100 miles, and so rich it produced 2 harvests a year. The island bore every kind of fragrant tree or root or herb or wood. It had the fruit of the vine, and the grain which is the food of man, and that other kind of food which we call pulse. And, of course, it was home to every kind of animal, including, Plato specifies, a great number of elephants. For a time, this civilization was virtuous. The 10 kings would meet, hunt a sacred bull without weapons inside the temple, and swear an oath over its blood to rule justly. But there was a date. The Egyptian priest told Solon that this all happened 9,000 years before his time, 9,000 years before Solon, who lived around 600 BC. That puts the existence, and the destruction, of Atlantis at roughly 9600 BC. This date is the single biggest problem in the entire story. It is the rock upon which all literal interpretations of Atlantis are broken. 9600 BC is not the Bronze Age. It is not the Iron Age. It is not even the Neolithic. It is the end of the Pleistocene. The very dawn of the Holocene. It is the Stone Age. Humanity was just emerging from the last great ice age, a brutal cold snap called the Younger Dryas. The ice sheets were still miles thick over North America and Europe. The world was populated by woolly mammoths, giant sloths, and saber-toothed cats. Human beings were hunter-gatherers, living in small, nomadic bands. We were just beginning to experiment with agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. We were making tools from stone, bone, and wood. We were living in caves and skin huts. The idea of a civilization in 9600 BC with organized armies, a navy of 1,200 ships, massive canal-digging engineering, metalworking, and a written language. It is not just improbable. It is impossible. It is a complete and total, screaming anachronism. And then, there is the destruction. Plato says this mighty empire, in its hubris, grew corrupt. The divine portion of their bloodline became diluted, and their human nature took over. They were filled with unrighteous avarice and power. They waged war, conquering parts of Europe and Africa, until they were stopped by a small, virtuous, ancient Athens. A city-state that Plato describes as existing 9,000 years before his own time, which is, again, an archaeological impossibility. There was no Athens in 9600 BC. After the war, Zeus, the king of the gods, looked upon the corruption of Atlantis and decided to punish it. He gathered the gods. And that is where the Critias ends. The text cuts off, mid-sentence. To find the end of the story, we have to go back to the Timaeus. Plato's description is short, brutal, and final. There occurred violent earthquakes and floods. And in a single grievous day and night, the island of Atlantis in like manner was swallowed up by the sea and disappeared. And this is the reason why the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is a shoal of mud in the way. And this was caused by the subsidence of the island, and that's it. That's the entire story. So, what do we have? A story of an impossible civilization, in an impossible time, told by a philosopher who was known for creating illustrative fictions, or noble lies, to make a philosophical point. The vast majority of classical scholars, archaeologists, and historians have a very simple and very clear answer. Atlantis is a myth. It is a noble lie. A philosophical allegory. Plato invented Atlantis as a literary device. He used it as a parable. The story of Atlantis is not about history. It's not about geology. It's about political science. Plato was living in the shadow of Athens' disastrous defeat in the Peloponnesian War. He had seen his city, a great naval empire that grew from the Delian League, become corrupt, arrogant, and hubristic. He saw it launch the disastrous Sicilian expedition, a failed invasion that cost it 200 ships and 40,000 men. He saw his city defeated by the land-based, agrarian, austere city-state of Sparta. And most traumatically, he had seen his mentor, Socrates, executed by the restored Athenian democracy. Plato hated democracy. He hated naval power. He believed it corrupted the soul of a state, making it greedy and unstable. So, he created a fable, Atlantis, the massive, wealthy, decadent, technologically advanced, naval empire that rules a continent. That was Plato's warning against imperial Athens. Atlantis is the ultimate might makes right state, the small, virtuous, agrarian, land-based ancient Athens that supposedly defeated it. That was Plato's ideal state. A small, incorruptible society, ruled by philosopher kings, much like the one he describes in his Republic. In the Republic, Plato lays out the blueprint for a perfect city. In the Critias, he shows us its opposite, the perfect, corrupt, material city. The story of Atlantis is a morality play. It's the allegory of the cave. It's the myth of Ur. It's Plato's warning that all human empires, no matter how great, will be destroyed by their own hubris. The ocean of mud that blocks the way, that's the impassable fog of a forgotten, cautionary tale. The greatest evidence for this? Plato's own student, Aristotle. The most brilliant mind of the ancient world, who studied under Plato for 20 years. Aristotle, who wrote about everything from physics to politics to biology, never once mentions Atlantis as a real place. In fact, later ancient writers quoted Aristotle as saying, "The man who dreamed it up also made it disappear." But, to complicate things, this isn't the only ancient opinion. Crantor, a follower of Plato in the next generation, writing a commentary on the Timaeus, apparently did believe it was history. The later philosopher Proclus, writing 800 years after Plato, claimed that Crantor had traveled to Egypt and had seen the very columns it says, covered in hieroglyphs, that told the story of Atlantis. This is, of course, a third-hand account. We don't have Crantor's original work. But it shows that from the very beginning, the debate was real, history, or allegory. For 2,000 years, the allegory side won. Atlantis was forgotten, dismissed as a philosopher's dream. Then, the mangled memory hypothesis emerged. What if the story is too specific? The rings, the orichalcum, the elephants, the 9,000 years, the canal measurements. What if these aren't just fictional details? What if they are garbled facts? This is the second great hypothesis. That Plato's story is not a myth, but a mangled memory, a distorted, third-hand echo of a real catastrophe, passed down for 1,000 years, like a game of telephone, until it reached Plato, who then used it for his own purposes. The first clue to unlocking this is the date. 9,000 years. It's the elephant in the room. What if, in the translation from Egyptian hieroglyphs, to Solon's Greek, to Critias's family story, a mistake was made? A single, simple, clerical error. What if the Egyptian symbol for 100 was misread as 1,000? This is a very common hypothesis. In that case, the disaster happened not 9,000 years before Solon, but 900. If we make that one simple change, 900 years before Solon's time, 600 BC, the date of 9600 BC suddenly becomes 1500 or 1600 BC, and 1600 BC is not the Stone Age. It is the absolute, glittering peak of the Bronze Age. And at that exact moment, the Mediterranean was home to a spectacular civilization that fits the description of Atlantis in terrifying, uncanny ways. We call them the Minoans. Based on the island of Crete, the Minoan civilization was Europe's first great leap forward. They were a thalassocracy, a naval empire. They controlled the Aegean. Their art was sophisticated, vibrant, full of life. Their palaces, like the one at Knossos, were sprawling, multi-story labyrinths with advanced plumbing, light wells, and beautiful frescoes of leaping dolphins and bare-breasted goddesses. They worshipped the bull. The myth of the Minotaur in the labyrinth is a garbled Greek memory of this civilization. And the famous bull-leaping frescoes at Knossos? They depict young men and women, acrobats, vaulting over the backs of charging bulls. This looks exactly like a ritualized version of what Plato described, the 10 kings, hunting a sacred bull without weapons in a central court. They were wealthy. They were powerful. They were a naval power. And they were, just like Atlantis, destroyed in a cataclysm. In 1628 BC, Just a few miles north of Crete, a volcano erupted. We call it Thera. Today, it is the beautiful, crescent-shaped island of Santorini, a postcard for tourists. But in 1628 BC, it was one of the single largest volcanic explosions in recorded human history. It was a cataclysm that dwarfs Vesuvius or Krakatoa. The explosion had the force of over 100,000 Hiroshima bombs. It literally vaporized the center of the island, 40 cubic kilometers of rock. It sent a plume of ash 25 miles into the sky, blotting out the sun, causing global climate change. We have evidence of its ash on Greenland ice cores. We have records of frost in summer from China. The sound of the explosion would have been heard thousands of miles away. It was the loudest sound in human history. The explosion triggered massive earthquakes. And it created a colossal tsunami. A wall of water, perhaps 500 feet high, moving at the speed of a jetliner, that raced across the Aegean. Excavations at Akrotiri, on the island of Thera, have found a Minoan Pompeii, a city perfectly preserved under 60 feet of volcanic ash. There are no bodies. They saw it coming. They fled, but they had nowhere to go. The tsunami would have hit the northern coast of Crete in less than 30 minutes. It would have annihilated their entire fleet, their ports, their coastal cities. We find pumice stone from Thera in the ruins of Minoan port towns on Crete. The evidence is clear. In a single day, the Minoan naval empire was shattered. Their power was broken. They went into a terminal decline, and were soon conquered by the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. Their memory faded, becoming myth. The parallels are stunning. A mighty, advanced, wealthy naval empire, with a bold cult, destroyed in a single day by earthquakes and floods. This, for many, is the most rational, scientific solution to the Atlantis mystery. Plato, hearing the garbled, 900-year-old story from Egypt, who did trade with the Minoans, their art is found in Egyptian tombs, simply took the core of this real event, the collapse of the Minoan civilization, and grafted his own philosophical ideas onto it. He got the story right, but he got the details wrong. He mistranslated the date, changing 900 to 9000. He mistook the concentric ring harbor of the city of Akrotiri on Thera, or perhaps the labyrinth at Knossos, for the whole city, and he misplaced the location, moving it from the Aegean to the great unknown, the Atlantic, to make it more mysterious and grand. The Minoan hypothesis is elegant. It is plausible. It is based on real, spectacular archaeology. It is, by far, the leading academic theory for a real Atlantis, but it doesn't satisfy the true believers. It doesn't satisfy those who read Plato literally, because Plato was specific. He didn't say the Aegean. He said beyond the Pillars of Hercules. He described a city of concentric rings, which Knossos is not. He described a continent, larger than Libya and Asia combined, which the island of Crete is not. He mentioned elephants. What if Plato meant exactly what he said? This is where the hunt goes into the fringe, into the vast, open ocean. What if we must look in the Atlantic? This was the theory of the 19th century politician and writer Ignatius Donnelly. In his 1882 book, Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, he argued that Plato's story was literal, factual history, that a great continent once existed in the middle of the Atlantic, and that it was the mother culture of all ancient civilizations, the Egyptians, the Maya, the Inca. He claimed the similarities between pyramids in Egypt and pyramids in Mexico were proof of a shared, lost ancestor, a diffusionist idea that was popular at the time. This hyper-diffusionism has since been entirely discredited, as we now know these civilizations developed their complex cultures independently. He proposed that the Azores Islands, which sit on the mid-Atlantic ridge, were the mountain tops of this sunken continent. The problem? Modern geology. 100 years of ocean floor mapping has given us a clear picture. The theory of plate tectonics. Continents are made of light, granitic rock. The ocean floor is made of heavy, basaltic rock. Continents do not sink, they drift. The mid-Atlantic ridge, where the Azores sit, is a constructive margin, a place where the seafloor is actively being created and pushed apart, not sinking. Donnelly's idea is geologically impossible. There is no sunken continent. This search for a lost land in the Atlantic was picked up by others, most famously by the sleeping prophet, Edgar Cayce. In the 1930s, Cayce, in a trance, claimed that Atlantis was a real, technologically advanced civilization that destroyed itself with a terrible crystal, a kind of power source that got out of control. He prophesied that a part of Atlantis would be discovered near the Bahamas in 1968 or 69, and right on schedule. In 1968, a line of massive, rectangular limestone blocks were found in shallow water off the coast of Bimini. It was called the Bimini Road. For a moment, it seemed Cayce was right. But, once again, geologists stepped in. The road was shown to be a natural formation, a type of big rock that fractures in perfect, block-like, geometric patterns. The Atlantic search, it seemed, was a dead end. But what if the city wasn't on a continent in the Atlantic? What if it was a coastal city, at the Atlantic, that was destroyed? This brings us to candidate number 2, southern Spain, the Gulf of Cadiz, just outside the Strait of Gibraltar. This is the exact location Plato specified, in front of the Pillars of Hercules. And in antiquity, this area was home to a civilization that was legendary, even to the Greeks, the kingdom of Tartessus. Tartessus was an impossibly wealthy, semi-mythical kingdom that flourished from 1100 to 500 BC. It was known for its vast mineral wealth, silver, gold, and tin. The Bible refers to it as Tarshish, a place from which King Solomon imported vast riches. The German archaeologist Adolf Schalten searched for it his entire life, calling it the Atlantis of the West. It was a port city, a hub of Atlantic trade, and then, around 500 BC, it mysteriously vanished from history. The location is perfect. The wealth is perfect. And the destruction method? The Gulf of Cadiz is one of the most seismically active zones in the Atlantic. The African plate is colliding with the Eurasian plate right here. It is a tsunami generation zone, a massive earthquake, like the 1755 Lisbon quake which destroyed the city and sent a 60-foot tsunami into Cadiz, could have sent a wave that would have wiped a coastal city like Tartessus completely off the map, burying it under silt. Plato's shoal of mud could be the silted-up river delta. In 2011, a team of researchers, led by Richard Freund, using satellite photos, ground-penetrating radar, and electrical resistivity tomography, claimed to have found evidence of a great city buried in the wetlands of Donana National Park, north of Cadiz. They saw strange rectangular shapes, and what looked like concentric rings, buried in the mud. They found memorial cities, smaller copies of the lost city, built inland by the survivors. It made headlines worldwide, but the theory quickly collapsed. Spanish archaeologists, who had been working in Donana for decades, refuted the claims. The concentric rings and rectangular shapes were not a lost Bronze Age city. They were much, much younger. They were Roman-era buildings, salt pans, and fish farming structures. The memorial cities were just other Roman settlements. The hunt in Spain went cold, which brings us to the new, explosive candidate. A theory born not of archaeology, but of the internet. A theory born of Google Earth, of satellite photos, and YouTube videos. A theory that claims the true, undeniable clue has been visible from space the entire time. It is called the Richat structure. The Eye of the Sahara, located in the nation of Mauritania, in the middle of the barren Sahara Desert. The Richat structure is one of the most bizarre and stunning geological formations on Earth. It is a perfect, 40-kilometer, or 25-mile, wide set of concentric rings. For decades, geologists were baffled by it. They assumed it was an asteroid impact crater. But there was no shocked quartz, no impact melt. Today, they have a clear answer. It is a natural formation. A domed anticline, a massive, 100-million-year-old geological dome of layered rock that has been slowly uplifted by magma from below, and then eroded, like a giant onion being peeled from the top down. The rings are simply different layers of harder and softer rock, eroding at different rates. It is a natural wonder, but look at it. It is a city of concentric rings. This is the clue that, proponents say, everyone missed. They claim this is not a geological formation. This is Atlantis. The evidence is, at first glance, shockingly compelling. First, the appearance. It matches Plato's description of a city of alternate zones of sea and land, concentric one with another more perfectly than any other place on Earth. It is the only candidate that looks like Atlantis. Second, the measurements. Proponents of this theory claim that if you measure the rings of the Richat structure, they are a near-perfect match to Plato's dimensions, if you use a specific conversion for the stadia. Plato's central island, 5 stadia. The Richat's inner ring, 0.9 kilometers, which is 5 stadia. Plato's first water ring, 1 stadium. The Richat's first moat about 0.17 kilometers, which is 1 stadium. The second land ring, 2 stadia. The second rock ring, 0.34 kilometers. 2 stadia. The matches are, they claim, uncanny. Third, the location. It is beyond the Pillars of Hercules. It is on the continent of Libya, the ancient Greek name for all of North Africa. Fourth, the topography. Plato said the city was on a plain, and that to the north were mountains from which rivers flowed. The Richat structure sits on the edge of a vast, flat salt plain to the south. And to the north? The Adrar Mountains. Fifth, the opening to the sea. Plato described a massive canal, 50 stadia, about 5 miles, long, that connected the city to the ocean. Proponents point to a channel-like feature that runs south from the structure, out onto the salt flats, which they claim was this canal, leading to the ancient Atlantic. Sixth, the elephants. Plato specifically mentioned elephants. Where is the Richat structure? Africa. A continent famous for elephants. Seventh, the date. Proponents point to the 9600 BC date. This aligns perfectly with the African humid period, or the Green Sahara. A time when the Sahara was a lush grassland, filled with lakes, rivers, and elephants. The case seems powerful. Too many coincidences. The exact shape, the mountains, the plain, the elephants, the measurements, the date. But this is where the search for Atlantis demands we be not romantics, but scientists. And when we apply scientific scrutiny, the Richat theory, like all the others, collapses. It collapses catastrophically. Let's take the evidence apart, piece by piece. The geology is definitive. It is not a man-made city. It is a 100-million-year-old eroded dome. The rings are not walls. They are layers of sedimentary and igneous rock. Geologists are unanimous on this. To believe it's a city is to ignore the entire field of geology. The opening to the sea. The channel to the south? It's a gully, a dry river bed, or wadi. And, as fluvial geomorphology shows, it flows into the structure, not out of it. It's the product of water eroding into the dome from the surrounding highlands, not a canal dug out to the sea. And what about the sea itself? This is the killer. The Richat structure is 400 kilometers, 250 miles, inland. And, more importantly, its base is over 1,000 feet, 300 meters, above sea level. For the Atlantic Ocean to have reached the Richat structure, global sea levels would have to be 1,000 feet higher. A sea level rise of that magnitude would not just give Atlantis a harbor. It would drown London, New York, Tokyo, and nearly every coastal region on the planet. There is no geological evidence for such a flood. It is a geophysical impossibility. The measurements? They are a case of cherry picking. The structure is 40 kilometers, 25 miles, wide. Plato's city, in total, was about 127 stadia, which is roughly 23 kilometers, 14 miles. They don't actually match. The structure is almost twice as big as Plato's city. Proponents have to use a specific, convenient conversion for the stadia, and measure from convenient, arbitrary points on the eroded rings to make the numbers fit. And the date? This is the final nail. Yes, the Green Sahara existed in 9600 BC. But who lived there? Stone Age hunter-gatherers. Neolithic people. The people who lived there at that time were not building empires. They were not working metal. They were not organizing navies of 1,200 ships. The theory conveniently pairs the climate of 9600 BC with the technology of 1600 BC and the geology of 100 million BC. It is a fantasy, which brings us to the final, fatal flaw. The archaeology. If this was the capital of a continent-spanning, Bronze Age-style empire, it would be the single greatest archaeological site on Earth. There would be something: pottery, metal tools, the foundations of the Temple of Poseidon, the orichalcum, the docks for 1,200 ships, the graves of its millions of citizens. Archaeologists have scoured the rich structure, and they have found nothing, that is, except for Stone Age tools, Acheulean hand axes, hundreds of thousands of years old, and Neolithic arrowheads. Exactly what we would expect to find in the Green Sahara. There is zero evidence of a city, zero evidence of a civilization, zero evidence of habitation on the scale Plato described. The rich structure is not Atlantis. It is a geological marvel, a spectacular case of pareidolia, our human tendency to see patterns, to see cities, in the clouds and in the rocks. It is a beautiful, seductive, and completely false lead. So the hunt ends, once again, empty-handed. The Minoan theory is plausible, but it's not a literal match. The Atlantic theories are literal, but they are not plausible. The rich structure is visually perfect, and scientifically impossible. This is where the search should end. But it doesn't. Because of that date, 9600 BC, for a new generation of researchers, this date is not a mistake. It is the clue. They argue that academics are wrong to dismiss it, because 9600 BC is not an arbitrary date. It is, perhaps, the most important date in modern human prehistory. It marks the exact end of the Younger Dryas, the last ice age. It marks the moment when the ice sheets melted, catastrophically. Between 10,800 BC and 9600 BC, the planet was plunged back into a deep freeze. Then, at 9600 BC, something happened. The planet warmed dramatically, 7 degrees Celsius in a single decade. The ice dams holding back colossal glacial lakes, like Lake Agassiz in North America, broke. The result was meltwater pulse 1b. An unimaginable torrent of fresh water that dumped into the oceans, raising global sea levels by over 100 feet in a matter of a few centuries. A single day and night of violent earthquakes and floods suddenly sounds plausible. This has led to the most explosive theory of all. What if Plato's date was right? What if the cataclysm was real, a global flood event at the end of the Ice Age? What if the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is correct? The idea that a fragmented comet struck the Earth around 10,800 BC, triggering the deep freeze, and that a second impact, around 9600 BC, ended it, causing the cataclysmic floods. This is a theory of global destruction, of skies on fire, of miles-high tsunamis, of a world remade. And what if Plato's description of a Bronze Age civilization was the anachronism? What if there was an advanced civilization during the Ice Age? A mother culture, as Donnelly proposed, a civilization that was wiped out by the Younger Dryas cataclysm, and whose survivors, the gods of antiquity, spread across the world, teaching the hunter-gatherer survivors the basics of agriculture and architecture, kickstarting the civilizations of Egypt, Sumer, and the Indus Valley. This is the theory of Graham Hancock and others. They point to Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a massive, sophisticated megalithic temple complex built in 9600 BC, built by people who were supposedly just hunter-gatherers. It features 20-ton T-shaped pillars, carved with intricate reliefs of animals and symbols. This, they say, is the smoking gun. This is the work of organized, sophisticated people. This is the work of the survivors. This is the ultimate clue no one saw. That the date is the key. That Atlantis was not a Bronze Age empire, but an Ice Age one. Larger than Libya and Asia, was not a continent, but a global, maritime civilization that lived on the coastal shelves, coasts that are now 400 feet underwater. The shoal of mud left by the sinking? The silt and sediment from the greatest flood in human history. It's a breathtaking, romantic idea. The ultimate conspiracy. That all of known history is wrong, but, just like every other theory, it has a fatal flaw. There is no evidence, none. Not a single orichalcum tool. Not a single piece of Ice Age machinery. Not a single ruin of an advanced city found on the ocean floor. Göbekli Tepe is astounding, but it is not Atlantis. It shows that hunter-gatherers were far more sophisticated than we thought, that they could organize to build massive stone monuments. But it is not a city. There is no metallurgy. There is no pottery. There is no writing. There is no evidence of the massive, organized military Plato described. It's an argument from absence. We have come full circle. We are back where we started, with Plato, and perhaps this is the final, true location of Atlantis. The search for a physical, geographical Atlantis is a fool's errand. It is the search for a place that never was. It is like searching for the literal location of Hogwarts, or the historical coordinates of Middle-earth. Plato told us what it was. A story. A parable. A thought experiment. The true clue that no one saw is the one that Plato left in plain sight, that the story is not about geology, but about philosophy. It's not about a lost continent. It's about a lost way, a warning about the corrupting nature of power, a warning that was aimed directly at his own city of Athens. The genius of Plato is that he created a myth so powerful, so alluring, so detailed, that we are still talking about it 2,400 years later. He launched the greatest treasure hunt in human history, for a treasure that was never buried, and yet, the idea of Atlantis is more real than any physical location could be. The story is a vessel for a timeless, terrifying warning, a warning about hubris, a warning about technological might, a warning about imperial overreach, the story of a great civilization, convinced of its own invincibility, that is destroyed overnight by forces it cannot control. Is that a volcano? Is it a tsunami? Is it a comet? Or is it climate change? Is it nuclear war? Is it our own arrogance? The true location of Atlantis is not in the Atlantic Ocean, or the Mediterranean, or the Sahara. It is not on a map of the world. It is on a map of the human soul. It is a mirror. It is a reflection. We see in it what we want to see, a lost golden age, a warning of our own impending doom, or simply a fantastic story. We will never stop searching for Atlantis, because it is, and always has been, a story about us.